Lake George Battlefield Moments, a production of the Lake George Battlefield Park Alliance, preserving our area's incredible history. A weekly feature on 93.5 FM and live streaming at lakefm.com. Here's the president of the Lake George Battlefield Park Alliance, John Denuzzo.
Welcome to Lake George Battlefield Moments. This is John Denuzzo of the Lake George Battlefield Park Alliance. I'm joined by my fellow trustee, Bruce Venter. Welcome, Bruce.
Thank you.
This week we want to focus on May the 10th, 1775, the capture of Fort Ticonderoga by the Patriots. Bruce, I know you have a lot of expertise in this area and really researched it a lot. What's your summary, first of all, before we get into the details? Is it as advertised, or were the Green Mountain Boys less of a driver, more of a driver? Who was really the key player in that capture?
Well, I'd like to say that Ethan Allen is the main player in this, and I'll get into it in more detail. But we also can bring our friend John Brown into it, because he is instrumental in letting colonial officials know that there's a fort that needs to be captured.
How about Benedict Arnold?
Well, he's not one of my favorites, so he will not do well in this podcast.
Okay. All right. Why don't you give us a little bit of background, how they came to decide that Fort Ticonderoga was ripe for the taking?
Okay. Well, in February of 1775, John Brown was solicited by Samuel Adams. I'm sure everybody's heard of him. He's the guy that makes the beer. And Dr. Joseph Warren. Those two patriots are running the colonial government of Massachusetts at the time. And they send Brown to Canada to take the temperature of the French and British merchants who are up there, and the tribes that are up there too, in terms of the Caughnawagas and like that, and to see if there is a rebellion. Now, remember, this is February, before the shots at Lexington and Concord. If there's a rebellion of the colonies, will Canada come in on the American side? And Brown talks to various people, and his assessment, because he's an attorney, he can make an assessment of what will fly and what won't fly. And he'll say to Adams and to Warren, look, they're lukewarm. We can't count on these people if there is a war that breaks out. He writes a letter to this effect on March 26th, I believe it is, 1775. And at the last paragraph, he says, also you should know that Fort Ticonderoga has plenty of cannon, I'm paraphrasing now, and should be captured if war breaks out. And I know just the people who could do it. And he's referring to Ethan Allen and the Green Mountain Boys. And so Adams and Warren have Brown continue in a situation where he'll be a liaison between Ethan Allen, the Green Mountain Boys, and the Massachusetts Provincial Congress. Now, at the same time, there is some speculation in Connecticut about whether Fort Ticonderoga should be captured or not. And the story goes that Samuel Holden Parsons, who's a colonel of militia, is riding back from the siege lines at the end of April 1775, because the shot heard around the world was the 19th of April, and the militia has surrounded the British in Boston. And he's riding back, and he runs into none other than Benedict Arnold. Benedict Arnold has been a merchant in Connecticut. He's been an apothecary. He's been a smuggler. And he is also captain of the 2nd Company of the Governor's Home Guard. And he activates that company to go to Boston and help the Massachusetts militia. And as he's marching in one direction, Parsons comes in the other directions. They meet and they have a conversation. And Parsons records this in a letter. Arnold tells him that there are a lot of cannon at Fort Ticonderoga. Parsons knows that the Americans, the rebels, need cannon in order to lay siege to Boston. What they have is not adequate. And so Parsons will ride hell for leather to Hartford to tell certain of his friends who are influential in the Connecticut government, you know, we ought to grab that Fort Ticonderoga. And probably they've had that letter that Brown wrote transcribed through the Committee of Correspondence. And that's another whole topic I don't want to get into at this point. But letters are going back and forth between the colonies. And so Parsons organizes a group of his colleagues, including Captain Edward Mott, and they're marching up from Connecticut to Massachusetts. In Pittsfield, they run into John Brown. They run into Colonel Easton, a militia colonel, and they join the group too. And so they end up going up to Bennington, where Ethan Allen holds his headquarters. He has a house there. His headquarters is the Catamount Tavern, Samuel Fay's Tavern, and this is where the whole plot will be hatched in Bennington to capture the fort, and Ethan Allen agrees. Now, I think a lot of people think that Ethan Allen captured Fort Ticonderoga because of the cannon. He could care less about the cannon. He had a beef with New York. Going back about 10 years, there had been land disputes up in what we call Vermont today. At the time, it was known as the Hampshire Grants. The governor of New Hampshire, Governor Wentworth, had sold land to settlers to make a profit for himself. And that land was between the Connecticut River and the colony of New York. And these hardscrabble farmers had done a lot to develop their property. New York, at the same time, they claimed that be able to sell that property. And so the governor of New York was selling the same property. Allen hated New York as a colony. He saw Fort Ticonderoga as a problem for him. If war developed, New York might favor the British and reinforce Fort Ticonderoga and put a crunch on what he was trying to do. Ethan Allen he's really a brilliant guy, but he's into some nefarious things. He's a land developer. Not that all land developers are nefarious, but he was selling property and then rebuying it and all like this from speculators. And he's afraid that the British post at Fort Ticonderoga is going to impinge on what he's trying to do in the Hampshire Grants. And so he loves the idea of capturing the fort, not for the cannon, but to get British presence out of the way. So he organizes the Green Mountain Boys, and on May the 10th, 1775, they make their way to Castleton, and then they make their way up to Hans Cove and wait for some watercraft to be able to get across Lake Champlain. Meanwhile, Benedict Arnold, who I mentioned earlier, has made his way to Massachusetts, has talked to Dr. Joseph Warren, and has secured a colonel's commission in the Massachusetts militia, along with, I think, 100 pounds for expenses, 10 horses. He's given the colonel's commission, he's given a letter to say raise up to 400 men. And as all this is transpiring, he hears that the Connecticutians are going up to take Fort Ticonderoga. And he says, I can't let that happen. I want to be the star. And so he gets on a horse, never raises any number of militia at all, and he races on his horse. He brings a valet with him, and he will get to Bennington. He'll miss out on seeing Ethan Allen, and he'll tell some of the boys that are there that, he's got this commission and he should be able to lead the attack on Fort Ticonderoga. They say, no, you don't know what you're talking about. And then he makes his way to Castleton, where he thinks Ethan Allen is going to be. Now, there's a question of whether Ethan Allen and Benedict Arnold meet at Castleton, Vermont, or later at Hans Cove. I have a feeling that they didn't meet at Castleton, but I'm working on that research now. Anyway, Benedict Arnold waves his commission, his paper, saying, I will command this expedition to capture Fort Ticonderoga and get the guns that Massachusetts needs. The Green Mountain Boys say, well, there's an expression they could say. I'm not going to say it, but they are not going to be led by Benedict Arnold. They are only going to be led by Ethan Allen. And they say that to Allen. They said, we're going to club our muskets and go home. Ethan Allen has a little bit of sympathy, I think, for Benedict Arnold, but he also sees that he can use him. Because what I didn't tell you before When Benedict Arnold is marching his company to Boston, that company has red uniforms on. Ethan Allen looks to Benedict Arnold, sees him in a red uniform. Maybe this guy can help me capture Fort Ticonderoga. And so he agrees to have Benedict Arnold come along with him. Now, they cross the lake, 83 men. They only can find a couple of boats and an old scow, and they row across. They get 83 men ready. The early morning hours of May the 10th. Ethan Allen will give a pep talk to the men and say, this is going to be a great adventure for us. It's going to take bravery, courage. If you're not up to it, don't come with us. There'll be no problem. Every man will grab his musket and march forward with Ethan Allen.
So we had a couple of unsavory characters here. Ethan Allen, Benedict Arnold. How did they get along after May the 10th? Did they have much contact with each other in the future?
Oh, yes. I mean, Ethan Allen was in command of the fort after it was captured, and Benedict Arnold still insisted that he be the commander. And then Ethan Allen basically had enough, and he will, a few days after the capture, he will leave and go back to the Hampshire Grants on the other side of Lake Champlain. But, yeah, there's some other parts of the story where they go up to, Benedict Arnold will go up to St. John's and capture a sloop up there so that the Americans will control Lake Champlain. Benedict Arnold is expressing some of the arrogance that he will show later in the war. And I think he's bringing out a personality that he's somewhat of a prima donna. And so that gets him into trouble when he doesn't get the promotions that he wants later in the war. And, of course, he becomes our most famous traitor.
So we've got all that happened May the 10th, 1775. As a postscript, last week's podcast, we talked about Fort George and May the 11th, or maybe the evening of May the 10th and May the 11th. Can you just tell us a little bit about how they got to Crown Point on May the 11th and who took that?
Yes. Well, as I said, only 83 men got across the lake in the initial expedition, and those are the men that captured the fort. Left on the other side, on the east side of Lake Champlain, was Seth Warner, who was Ethan Allen's third in command. And he will eventually bring another 100 men across the lake later in the day on March the 10th. Some records will say that he captured Crown Point on the 10th. I don't believe that's true. I believe that he tried to row up in bateau up Lake Champlain, which is really down Lake Champlain because it flows from south to north. He will be turned back initially, and so the next day he will capture Crown Point. He captures about 15 soldiers and an officer and about 100 guns. So it's another great victory in terms of the overall American cause. And it also destroys another British installation, which is what Ethan Allen wants to do. Ethan Allen doesn't want any British presence in the lake region, and he doesn't want the British helping New York colony in any way whatsoever, because he's trying to get his men to secure their property, and it's not going very well because there's a lot of litigation prior to the war about getting the Green Mountain Boys off of their property and like that.
Wow. It's amazing that, a few short weeks after Lexington and Concord, that this fledgling effort of the Patriots got basically Crown Point South, Crown Point, Ticonderoga, Fort George, control for the cause so close to Canada, just basically from British negligence or apathy, I guess. Well, thank you, Bruce. This helps paint the picture for
There's a lot more to the story.
Yes. Well, we'll tell you more about the story. If you wanted to check last week's podcast, we talked about Fort George, and certainly you'll be hearing a lot on the capture of all these forts as 1775 unfolds. Thank you, Bruce Metter.
Thank you.
And a Lake George Battlefield Moments podcast is over. Our website is lakegeorgebattlefield.org.
Lake George Battlefield Moments, a production of the Lake George Battlefield Park Alliance, preserving our area's incredible history. For more on this topic, check out the Lake George Battlefield Park Alliance podcast, a weekly feature on Lake FM 93.5 FM and live streaming at lakefm.com. For more information, go to lakegeorgebattlefield.org and tune in for Lake George Battlefield Moments,